Hi everybody, I'm Lora Hart. Thanks for joining me for Tuesday Talks. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about pricing your handmade jewelry. A lot of things go into pricing, and I have a cheat sheet and I'm going to take a look at it just to make sure I don't forget anything important. When you're pricing your work, you want to take into consideration the supplies you're using, your labor, your overhead, and profit, which is actually the most important thing. So when you're thinking about your supplies, are you using beads and metal? Are you using alternative materials? That all plays a really big part in what your end price is going to be. If you're using free found objects for your work, obviously the cost of your supplies is going to be very, very low. If you're using beads and gemstones and metals, your price is going to be higher for those things. So they all need to be taken into consideration when you are doing your pricing formula. As far as labor goes, depending on how much experience you have and what your education is, that should also be taken into consideration when you figure out your labor fees. If you're just starting out, maybe you just want to charge whatever the minimum wage in your area is. If you're more experienced, you have more education, then of course your labor costs will rise in relation to your skill level. When you are learning a new skill, you can't charge for your learning curve. So if something is taking you 5 hours to do that anybody else could do in a half hour, you can only charge a half hour's worth of labor. You can't charge the customer for your learning curve. So that's something else really important to keep in mind. What is overhead? Overhead is your cost of doing business, and that could include things like your studio overhead. Whether you're actually paying for an outside studio or your studio is in your home, you have to take into consideration the space you work in, rent, or the portion of the rent of your home or apartment that you might be using. You want to take into consideration your lighting, water bill, everything that goes into your actual space put into your studio element of your overhead. You want to take into consideration office supplies like packaging, postage, your business cards, your wrapping materials, postage materials. So if you are selling at a show, obviously you're talking about gift bags and tissue paper and your business cards, possibly postcards. If you're mailing, you're talking about your labor in mailing. You're also talking about the postage and the packing materials. So all of those things have to be charged in some way. They have to be charged back to the customer. You also want to think about your subscriptions, magazines, if you belong to a guild, if you belong to SNAG, which is the Society of North American Goldsmiths, which is a really great group to be a part of, or if you're part of the Enamelist Guild or whatever. You want to take into consideration where you're selling. Are you selling at craft fairs? Then you have booth fees. Associated with the booth fee is also your booth setup. So you've got booth furniture, you've got display items. All of that needs to be considered in your cost of doing business. Do you have helpers? Do you have minions who help you at the show? Or maybe you have someone come into the studio occasionally right before a show to help you get ready and do some of the easier tasks for getting your jewelry ready. Do you have a website? The website costs for the URL hosting, for the website hosting, for putting the website together. Even if you did it, you want to charge for that. And of course, you need to charge for your tools and equipment. All of that gets depreciated, of course, but you still need to put a little bit in for things like your kiln, your hammers and files and things that are going to be permanent. You also have to keep in mind that you need to replace things occasionally, like sandpaper or Fordham bits and tools need to be replaced often. So all of that needs to be considered in your cost of doing business as well. Then you also want to think about profit. Profit gets added on at the end, and that's really what we all want to make sure that we get when we're selling. The materials cost will go back into doing your next buying session and buying new materials for your new pieces that have yet to be made. Your overhead goes back into paying your studio rent. Whether you have a studio right now or not doesn't really matter. You might have one in the future, and you have to start the way you plan to end. So if your plan is to get bigger, have a studio later, maybe you want to have some helpers in your studio, you have to plan for it from the start. So that figure has to be put into there. And then, of course, profit. So all of the materials that I've mentioned before go back into the business. The profit is what is going to help you pay your own rent, help you pay for your own car and personal taxes and vacations and things like that. So profit is really one of the very most important things that you can charge for. Some people have a really hard time figuring all that out. It's too much for them to handle. Frankly, it's too much for me to handle. I don't know any artist who really likes to do pricing. So you might want to come up with a formula like materials and labor times 4 or times 3 plus profit, and that will be your wholesale cost. If you're not wholesaling right now, you have to assume that someday you might be wholesaling. You can't sell to the public for wholesale prices. Sometime when you're selling, somebody might come up to your booth, oh, I love your things, I'd love to have you in my gallery. And if you're already selling at your wholesale price, the retailer is going to want to pay you half of that, and then you won't be making any money at all. So right from the get-go, you have to assume that you must figure out a wholesale price, and then either double it or multiply it by 2.5 times to get a retail price. You also want to consider perceived profit, perceived value. Excuse me, that's what I meant. Do you have a teeny tiny little bit of gold? Any amount of gold, of course, is going to raise the perceived value of your work. So if you are using the tiniest little piece of kombu foil, and you know that that kombu foil only cost you $1, you still have to really charge for that because it's gold. The perceived value of gold is worth every penny it's going to get for you. Just checking my notes here. So let's see. Yes, I've talked about labor and materials times 3 or 4 will equal your wholesale price. We've talked about your studio overhead, and we want to also talk about the recognition factor that you've got. Do you have a following? Do you have a reputation for doing work? Then you can raise your prices, either raise the overall price, or you might want to raise your labor cost if that's easier for you. Where are you selling? A lot of times people figure out their pricing and then they think, oh my God, that's way too expensive. I can't afford that. I have to let you know that you are not your own customer. I can't afford my own work. I can't afford my friend's work most of the time unless they're sweet enough to sell it to me for the wholesale price. So depending on where you're selling, you might have to create work that is saleable in the market that you want to stay in. Perhaps you only want to stay in your neighborhood. You only want to do shows in your area. You want to do home shows, or you want to do trunk shows at the beauty parlor or at a cute boutique around town. So if you only want to stay home to sell, then you have to price your work and make your work for what your market will bear. If you want to make work that will not sell in your area, then you have to be willing to find your market either online, or you have to be willing to do craft shows around the nation. Some people will do shows every single weekend. I know, which is ridiculous to me. Out of the 52 weekends, I know somebody who sells 40 weekends of the year, which for me would be absolutely prohibitive. I wouldn't do that. So when I am making my own work and I want to sell it, and I only do live shows during the Christmas season, I make sure that the work that I am making, the work that I am selling, will sell in my area at the venue that I want to sell at. So I sell at a couple of higher end craft shows. I don't sell at the lower end church shows or school shows or things like that, because my work won't sell. So it is not worth it to me to sell at those venues. So all of these things go into pricing. It's very confusing, but it's one of the most important and most rewarding things you'll do to figure it out. If you use a pricing schedule, that's great. If you figure out each one and use a one of the inventory options online to help you figure it out, that's great too. But remember that the most important things you want to consider are that you want to make sure you develop a wholesale price and then double it for your retail price. And you also want to make sure that you take into consideration profit. If you don't have profit, you're not going to be able to go forward. You're not going to be able to support yourself. So those are the most important things. If you will go to my website, metalclay101.blogspot.com, there is a resources page, and I have linked to some really great pricing strategy articles and PDFs and podcasts. So if you need more help, you can go there. And thank you so much for joining me today. I'll talk to you next week. Bye.